Thanks for joining us. A tough topic is human trafficking. We're going to talk about that with an expert, Krishna Patel, Justice Initiative Director at Grace Farms Foundation in New Canaan. Thanks so much for coming on.
You bet.
And for those of you who don't know Grace Farms, I just want to show you some pictures. It's a beautiful 80-acre farm. Grace Farms Foundation supports initiatives in the areas of nature, arts, justice, community, and faith, and encourages participation locally and globally. The foundation carries out its work through the publicly available facilities and integrated programs of Grace Farms. A lot of important work goes on at this place. Open 6 days a week, open to the public, but many lectures. How did you become the Justice Initiative Director there?
So the folks at Grace Farms, before it opened, actually asked me to come from the work I was doing at the U.S. Attorney's Office. So I had been with the two U.S. Attorney's Offices starting in 1999 until 2015, where I had the opportunity to do a lot of work on a lot of issues relating to child exploitation, human trafficking, and even counterterrorism. And believe it or not, some of that overlaps.
Talking about human trafficking, and it's a topic that we know it's out there, we know it's awful, but it's almost invisible to most of us. But it's everywhere. And we talked about the nail industry in the state of Connecticut that is not regulated. One of, I think, the only state in the nation that is not regulated. Where is human trafficking in that industry?
So the nail industry in particular, it's one of what we call typologies, areas in human trafficking that we know are very high risk areas. Nail salons, and the nail industry is one of them, and so it's no surprise. I think what causes a vulnerability for Connecticut is by having it completely unregulated. For an industry that we already know is an at-risk industry, it creates even more incentives to actually utilize that industry even more for trafficking victims. So you have certain industries that we know are high risk, for example, construction, including here in Connecticut, the illicit massage industry, including here in Connecticut. These are certain industries we see throughout our 50 states, some that we see throughout the world. I think it's very important for all the viewers to understand human trafficking is the second largest criminal industry in the world.
And how does it happen typically?
It has been estimated, and these are very conservative estimates, about 40.3 million people are enslaved at any given time. Those are the estimates based on the Global Slavery Index that was done in 2016. Very conservative numbers, and of which about 70% of that is forced labor.
And what does it mean to be enslaved in this kind of world?
So a very simple way of trying to explain what is a little bit of a complicated definition is it's compelled work. By work, it is something that has commercial value to it. So there's other things that are crimes that can be equally horrible, but that would not be considered trafficking because they don't have that commercial work value to it. And that it's done under some type of force, fraud, or coercion. Essentially, you're not free to leave.
So if a woman is brought into this country, let's say it's in America, and she ends up in the nail industry, they're not getting paid? Are they living in groups? What's happening to them when they're not in the nail salon?
So you're definitely under controls, right? And so what we see, particularly when we're dealing with the immigrant population, oftentimes the workers will be undocumented. One thing that we see that's very common is their documents are taken away. We see, so if you imagine going to another country and having your documents taken away from you, right? You don't know the language, you don't know the protocols. Sometimes you owe money to your traffickers, or your family owes money to those traffickers. You're under some type of indentured servitude to pay it back. And oftentimes what we will see is the traffickers actually charge them for housing or for food, and you end up in this indentured servitude that you're never able to pay back.
How prevalent is that in the state of Connecticut, or let's say even New England?
So the hardest thing about human trafficking is the data, right? It is important, but it is imprecise. Based on our Department of Labor, based on what they're seeing on the ground, they will tell you that they see our nail salons, our restaurant industry, our construction industry, illicit massage, pretty much up there in terms of very high risk here in Connecticut.
Have we made inroads in this at all? Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? Where are we?
So I think we have done a much better job with awareness. When I first started, I had actually run one of the first task forces in the country out of Connecticut. in 2003, and at that point, the words human trafficking were not even known. I think today it's something that people have certainly heard of. I think what concerns me for a lot of folks here in the U.S. is there is an interest in hearing about human trafficking if it's, you know, happening in Thailand or India or Africa. But when it's happening in our own backyard, when we realize that the minor sex trafficking industry is largely American girls, right, who are being trafficked. There's also an issue where it is significant that sex trafficking of minors is happening, but that so much of it is things that we're complicit in. When you look at the global numbers on at-risk products, these are numbers that are not even identified as criminal. It is believed that just if you take a look at the top 5 at-risk products coming into the G20 countries, that it is $354 billion worth of goods that people like you and I are consuming. So it is, and if you really look at it kind of on a map, it is that the consumption of the global north is rooted in the slavery of the global south. So when you buy your clothes, when you're buying that piece of fish, when you're buying that piece of chocolate, that, you know, at the root of that is a slave. And so it's our own consumption, too, that's causing so much of the slavery in the world.
Technology as well.
Technology is the number one,
Huge amount.
right? So all of us carry a smartphone. When you think of the cobalt, you know, I'd invite all of your viewers just to Google the cobalt industry itself and look at how much of the cobalt industry is just all about child slavery.
How does the normal person, when they're out and about, traveling about, in a restaurant, how do we recognize when somebody may be held against their will? It's hard, right?
It's very hard. And you know what I always say to everybody about this is it's important that everyone not become their own investigator, or, you know, because it is a very dangerous industry, or can be. I think the most important thing, there are red flag indicators. You can find them. For example, Polaris has a wonderful site. DCF, the Department of Children and Families, also puts red flag indicators. There are hotlines you can call, so if you are reluctant to call, for example, the police because you think something really might be wrong, you can call the Polaris hotline. And there's people who are there trained 24/7 to actually take the information. And the most important thing you can do is the facts. But it is your gut that's going to tell you something is wrong more than anything else, including in our hotel industry, right? Connecticut was the first state in the country that passed legislation to train the hotel industry. Not because we believe that it's complicit, but we know there's such a huge nexus between where traffickers take young girls and boys to have them trafficked. And so we wanted the lodging industry to be our partners in this. And that is something that has now grown and is growing throughout the country. But I do think the awareness issue, because it is a clandestine crime, because it is, as you said, an invisible crime, because it is the 3rd largest crime, and we now believe the fastest growing crime in America, you know, it is important that we all do our part.
So we're really not gaining on it. We're maybe gaining on recognizing who's being trafficked, but it's still, you know, you could be passing a truck on I-95 and there could be children in it, or women,
Absolutely.
or men, which makes you want to stop every truck on I-95. Because it's everywhere, right?
It is everywhere. It's everywhere. It's a hidden crime, and it is everywhere. And, you know, I think what's so hard about this crime is also the victimization. There's so many of the victims or the survivors, you know, initially as victims, they don't even see themselves as victims, right? How many of the young girls, you know, my youngest victim in a case here in Connecticut was 12 years old. They don't view themselves, you know, as victims, you know, and yet they're being raped sometimes 10 to 12 times a day.
How do they not see themselves as a victim?
I think so much of this is, you know, all of the vulnerabilities and difficulties where some of these girls get caught into this, and what the traffickers are so good at, creating this kind of what has been called a family myth dynamic. And, you know, where the trafficker is the person who loves them, who cares for them, and is able to create a bond that they don't actually see law enforcement as, you know, as wearing the white hat, coming in and saving them, which makes this crime even harder for law enforcement to actually detect, even harder for law enforcement to go in and work on. And yet we know the numbers. I think when I came last year, we talked about Backpage, right? The impunity with which that was happening was really shocking.
How did you end up in this industry? Because it's really tough.
It is tough. It is tough. You know, back in 1999, even in New York, we were seeing what we knew was trafficking. And at that time, a lot of exploitation. At that time, primarily women and girls. Although we know we're not doing a good job identifying with men and boys yet. We've done a much better job here in Connecticut. If you look at the cases this past year in particular, we've done a much better job with that. But you know, at that time, we didn't have the Trafficking Victims Protection Act either. And you knew what, particularly in the undocumented community, you were starting to realize it was really slavery. It was a form of slavery. And so it was through that kind of deep exploitation that I had a very strong interest in working on this issue. And you know, this is what we see here, and we see, you know, throughout our country. But you know, take it to the global world. You know, there is no stronger legal norm than the one against slavery. It is against the law in every country in the world. And yet we started seeing our non-state terrorist groups for the first time putting out manifestos to encourage slavery. So for example, ISIS with the Yazidi women and girls. And in fact, this year, you know, Nadia Murad, who won the Nobel Peace Prize, she was enslaved by ISIS, right? And the slavery that just terrorist groups have engaged in, both as a psychological weapon of war, but also to finance. So this idea that we're seeing slavery come back, the idea that there are more people enslaved today than at any other time in human history is something that should concern all of us.
So how do we as consumers live a better life to get in the way of this, to disrupt it?
So I think the most important thing is to understand what are the most at-risk products. It's very hard right now to look at a whole supply chain. And I think there's some corporations that do a wonderful job of going to the root of it and trying to do everything they can. So for example, Patagonia does just an incredible job of doing everything they can to make sure to try to get rid of slavery in their supply chain. And here's a CEO that when he found slavery, self-reported it to the Atlantic and said, if it's in my supply chain, it's in every supply chain in the world. And tasked his people to say, this is not who we are, and this is not okay. But there's a lot of other companies who either are just neglecting it, or some who enjoy the willful blindness of the complexity of global supply chain.
Because it's cheaper?
Because goods and services are cheaper, right? If labor's free at the end, you know, and I think for all of us, we have to ask ourselves the question, you know, we all enjoy getting goods and services at a cheaper price. And have we ever thought, what is the cost of that at its root? When you've ever bought your $2.99 t-shirt, have you ever thought that at the root of that, there's child slavery, or there's a man or a woman who's enslaved? You know, you saw the Rana Plaza disaster, right? It's almost to the day, the anniversary of that. And, you know, people with bars, you know, when that fire happened, who got killed, who were totally enslaved, making our clothes. You know, the clothes we buy every day. And so I think as consumers, we have to demand more of the type of transparency that good corporations can give. And we know that corporations can and be better about transparency. We have to certainly understand what the at-risk products are in our country. When you know that it's the seafood industry, when you know it's chocolate, cocoa, sugarcane.
The people picking the chocolate.
Yeah, the cocoa, the actual cocoa, right? And some of that is because so much of that is in certain areas of the world. You know, when you look at the cobalt, 75 to 80% is actually in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Cocoa, similarly, is in West Africa. You know, we have to be better. And there's chocolate companies, one at Grace Farms that we promote called Tony's Chocolonely, that goes out of its way, all the way to the root, to take a look at the cocoa farms.
Where is it based?
It's a Belgian company, but they sell throughout the United States, and they do such an amazing job to make sure that their supply chain, you know, as best as they can, but a really wonderful job to make sure that it's not children who are enslaved or tortured.
How do we in schools then teach this to be better consumers as we grow up? How do we do this? It's tough. I mean, how do we do all the research on all these companies and where the goods are coming from? What's the answer to that?
So one of the things I had actually recommended this year at a forum that I was just with, when I was asked what would I do, I said, I think if all of us could just ask, as the state of Connecticut, our state tax dollars, if we took every single school, including UConn, and I would love to see this, particularly the UConn's women's basketball team. But if you took every single school and said, just take your just the athletic department, and just let's try for a year to source that slave free. I think for all of us, we would learn a lot. I think we'd be the first state in the country to do it. I think we'd be making an incredible statement about slavery and the fact that, we are going to be the abolitionists, of today. And how about that our state dollars are not going to go to actually support slavery in the world. And by the way, two amazing companies are Adidas and Nike. They are actually two amazing companies. And I think those are two companies that actually might respond really well to this kind of exercise.
We have a new governor. Do you plan to meet with him?
So, believe it or not, he has this 100-day plan, and I've actually sent it to his folks that this is something we should consider.
I think that's terrific. Well, I thank you so much for enlightening us about this, that we should be better consumers and look and read and do the homework and stop this horrible crime that's going on right beneath our noses. Thank you so much for
Not at all. If I could just end with, there's something called slaveryfootprint.org.
Please.
If everybody just goes on slaveryfootprint.org and takes the survey, you'll know how many slaves, the approximate number of slaves that work for you based on your consumption.
Thank you. Important.
So, yes.
Do that.
So thank you.
You're welcome.
All right.
Spend all night kissing and the bumper's right here, then who else is missing? Got a little sidetracked if I'm a wishing to find the keys to the door, but it's also a metaphor. Things keep locked in the grocery store of the mind. Just to save time, skip right ahead to the last ride.